So what's a pandemic? So basically, it's very straightforward. It's a global infection outbreak, but it has to have a number of attributes. It has to be caused by a novel pathogen or microbe to which all or most of the world's population is susceptible. And that's why seasonal flu doesn't cause pandemics, because all of us at some point in our lives have been exposed to influenza many times, and so there's a large degree of population immunity. But if a whole new influenza came along, and I'll scare you in a few minutes talking about H5N1, then just again going over the definition of a pandemic. So the other issue there is not as it have to be a novel pathogen or microbe, it has to be transmissible from person to person. And that's why we don't see avian influenza pandemics at the moment, because most of them can go from a bird to a person, but not person to person. And then the WHO has decided that it has to affect at least 3 world regions. So you can quickly see why COVID-19 became COVID-19 as a pandemic. So epidemics and pandemics have shaped history forever and a day. The one that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen is actually the spread of the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, from its emergence initially in Asia, where the bacterial pathogen Yersinia pestis was associated with rodents, and as rodents moved across the world with the expansion of trade between what was Asia and Europe at the time, it brought with it this particular bacteria, which is spread typically by the bite of an infected flea. But ultimately, when enough people become infected, it forms a pneumonic plague and is able to spread person to person just through a respiratory droplet spread. The one on the right, of course, is what we saw back in 1918, 1919 with the Spanish flu pandemic. And the interesting is there's lots of pandemics, but people really only get excited about pandemics when they're incredibly deadly, which is the typical problem with humans, is that we only pay attention to things that are likely to kill us. And we really don't care if we got the flu in 2009 because I recovered from it or whatever. So these are actually the 5 deadliest pandemics by population impact. Does anybody, if you know this, I automatically make you an ID doctor. Does anybody know what caused the Peloponnesian War pestilence? Like, this is so obscure, like you would be really smart if you know. Pardon me?
Like Jeopardy.
Yeah, Jeopardy smart. Like you would be a 5-time winner, and you know probably make $500,000.
Probably Greek.
Actually, no, it's actually worldwide. So this is actually a disease called epidemic typhus, and that's caused by a rickettsial organism, Rickettsia typhi. And we don't see epidemic typhus anymore because basically, all the appropriate things we've done in the advanced world to ensure hygiene, so you don't have lice running around, body lice, biting people and infecting them with rickettsia. And it actually killed off 25% of the known world at that time. The Antonine plague, you've heard of this disease, but you've just never heard of this, the Antonine plague. Anybody want to make a couple of guesses? It's a vaccine preventable disease. That's your only clue. It's actually measles. And measles, and that was just near, it sort of accelerated the decline of the Roman Empire around that time. The plague of Justinian is actually the same as the Black Death. It's bubonic plague. It's Yersinia pestis that occurred. And of course, the Spanish flu is influenza. So we always get excited about the Spanish flu. I certainly do, because when Spanish flu struck at the end of the First World War, it killed more humans in the inner seas in the period of a similar duration in the history of the world. Does anybody know when the Spanish flu pandemic stopped? So everybody thinks it's 1919, right? No, 1928. It actually took 10 years for it to disappear. But even then, sort of public indifference to the Spanish flu and all the deaths it created made people believe that it was over in a year, and it took a decade to disappear eventually. The last waves of what was then the pandemic H1N1 Spanish flu organism disappeared its last wave in 1928, which was very close to of course, the initial decline in the stock market and the Great Depression during the 30s. And Spanish flu was interesting. I mean, it spread very quickly at a time when we didn't have air travel. I mean, you had ships that were going across the ocean, and you certainly had trains and things like that, but there was no air travel. And there were 3 significant successive waves in the period of 18 months between 1918 and 1919. And the highest mortality was actually seen in the second and third waves and not the first wave. And that's because people experienced the first wave with a lot of restrictions that were put in place. And so they said, oh, this isn't so bad. not many died. So let's go back. And then I could show you some really boring slides that show cities that declined to keep public health restrictions in place really got hit during the second and third wave. And if you look at their first wave, it was nothing. So this is what happens during pandemics. And as I said, the last wave was seen in 1928. The death rate of Spanish flu was 25 times higher than any of the previous pandemics that we were aware of, and certainly influenza ones. And of course, this big estimate of somewhere between 20 and 40 million people who died worldwide. But the fascinating thing about this disease, as opposed to COVID-19, is it actually killed off young adults. It did not kill off old people, which is what COVID likes to do. Children didn't seem to suffer as much, but young adults were dying. And I was taught by a microbiology professor back in medical school that there's very few things that'll kill you in 24 hours. One of them is Neisseria meningitis, which causes meningococcal disease or meningococcal meningitis. But influenza took people, the descriptions by physicians at that time was somebody who was perfectly well that morning when they got up. They started to feel unwell. They went to bed. They were found in the morning sort of grayish blue, and then they died the next, within a few hours. So that's like 24 hours to kill you. So that's a pretty deadly thing when you're susceptible. And this is an example of some of the posters that were posted about what you should do. You should go home if you feel sick, stay in bed until you're well, and then follow all the other public health restrictions and things that were in place. And this is just a quick little graphic that sort of show you how the flu spread over a period of what was 4 weeks in the United States. That's Spanish flu. That's how fast it zipped across the country. Now, of course, once you got to the States, you had trains and other conveyances to get you around, but it spread very, very quickly from early September through to early October in 1918. So influenza pandemics we've known about. The first one that's been described that we're pretty darn sure was influenza, because based on the descriptions, was back in 1510. So back really at the exit of the Middle Ages. And then between 1510 and 1918, we think there were at least 9 recorded influenza pandemics. We don't know the specific etiology of them, but we can make some pretty good guesses. The one that's a bit scary is actually this one, H3N8, because neuraminidase 8 antigen has not been described in most human influenzas. Most human influenza are either H1N1 or H3N2, and sometimes H2N2, but rarely one with that remarkably a different neuraminidase. And so it makes forecasting kind of weird. So you can see what happened from the late 1800s, where we had the first so-called Russian flu, because there was another Russian flu in 1977, where these have sort of popped up. All of them with varying levels of morbidity and mortality. So it's hard to make lots of comparisons, other than Spanish flu, which was really bad. This is actually from a poster that we just okayed today with my colleagues, talking about H5N1, which is an avian strain of influenza. And it emerged in Hong Kong in the late 1990s, around 1996, 97. And some of you who might remember some of the stories, and they had to cull like literally something around 100 million chickens and ducks in Hong Kong, because they just killed them off, because it's a pretty deadly influenza, and most avian species will die with it. So all those nice little ducks and geese and things that you see floating around on Lake Ontario, they're all got avian flu. That's actually where flu lives. Flu lives in aquatic birds all around the world. And so it is a zoonotic infection. It emerges from that reservoir, can infect us. Fortunately, it doesn't do it often, and it doesn't maintain, it isn't sustained. So, if you look at H5N1, it's been around now for getting close to maybe 30 years, and we're still just seeing sporadic outbreaks. However, what's got us worried, and which you can't see on this poster, I think particularly well when you look at it, is we've had a record number of H5N1 outbreaks across the country and across the globe, actually. And we have seen now its emergence into other animals or mammalian species. So it always has the potential to make that jump and become a mammalian virus. And once it does that, it's a little smaller jump to become one to be able to infect humans. So we're paying a lot of attention to this, because this is the one that we are thinking maybe, hopefully not, but maybe in the next decade or two might actually create the next pandemic flu. So this is old news. Many of you know that the pandemic was declared on March 11th, 2020, but it was already described as a public health emergency of international concern by WHO in January. And for people like me, we were really noticing it on January 1st, which was the day after the Chinese reported the Wuhan cases of an unusual pneumonia, which they thought might be due to what looked like a coronavirus. And And this has really consumed us now, obviously, for the last, getting on to be almost 3 years. At the end of this year, December 31st, 2022, it'll actually be 3 years since it happened because it was first reported in 2019. That's what's called COVID-19. So how did COVID spread over the first 18 months in the United States? I just use this as a graphic, not because I like the United States. If Canada produced this graphic, I would use a Canadian one. But this is just sort of to show you what happened. I think I have to go this, there we go. And you can see its emergence on the West Coast first, and then very quickly within 3 months, it was seen pretty well across the United States. And now we're getting into the summer of 2020, and you can see some areas where the color is darker, and that indicates more cases per capita. And then as we move into the fall, because this is a bit of a seasonal virus, these colors start to become more dominant. So this is what we're now seeing in the fall. And if you actually map this, it maps pretty well to Trump's voters. By the time December rolled around, now you're going to see the effect of Alpha through January. Alpha was the first variant after the ancestral one. And you saw all those dark colors that sort of popped up. And then we had a reasonable spring. Americans were getting vaccinated. We're still wearing masks, some of them very reluctantly. But then by July, August, you're going to see the emergence of Delta. When Delta hits, you're going to just see the whole map go dark. And here's Delta arriving in the United States. And again, at this point, they had basically just decided to give up. Americans, as you know, sort of believe in the individual more so than society. And you guys, unfortunately, are an example of people who care more about people around you than yourself necessarily. That's a thing us doctors do. So the other thing I can show you is the emergence of these variants. We just talked a little bit about it. And you can see, I want you to watch this, especially pay attention to the scale on the left-hand side, which is the estimated number of cases. So you can see the impact of Alpha in early 2021. And then as we get into the summer, you're going to see the emergence of Delta, which percolates along through the fall. And then watch the scale on the left when you hit Omicron, which is going to happen right about now. It just shoots right off the map. And this is the evolution of a virus that is adapting itself better and better to infecting humans. And I could bore you to tears with the mechanistic reasons why the different variants outcompeted each other evolutionarily. But what Omicron really did well was it was able to go and infect children much more efficiently. The previous variants and the ancestral variant relied on a system that requires a receptor, which in this room is expressed a lot because we're all slightly older, and is not expressed a lot in children. But when Omicron evolved itself to getting a whole other means of infecting a cell, which bypassed that thing, which sort of semi-protected children to some extent. So it just went right off the map. You can see from, this is the report from yesterday, the official report of cases around the world, 631 million people with 6.5 million people dead. That's a gross underestimate. Most of my colleagues would suggest at the very least you can multiply that by 4 or 5. And in fact, if you read The Economist, which is a really cool publication, they've actually they published a story just I think it was about a month ago, in which if you multiply by 4, what you actually get for instance, with global excess death measurements is probably about 26 million people who have died of COVID, which puts it on the same level as the Spanish flu. And of course, as you can see, the official global COVID-19 deaths lower. And so people who are ideologically opposed to the idea that COVID was a thing and call COVID a hoax, they always go, well, not many people have died. It's not like the Spanish flu or anything. So one of the things that we can do around pandemics in general is strategies to control them. And I put vaccination in red because it's the #1 strategy. And I think the amazing thing about COVID-19 is we developed vaccines within 12 months. Yes, we had treatments within 3 or 4 months. My colleagues and I did client randomized controlled trials that showed that dexamethasone, for instance, was saving people's lives who were intubated in hospital settings. But it was really the rollout of the vaccination in December of 2020 that really reduced the overall mortality and severity of the disease. And it's always been a strategy. And our main pandemic influenza strategy is to get a pandemic flu vaccine out as soon as we possibly can if we get hit with something like H5N1. There are lots of other things you can do in the meantime. So they're affectionately known as NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, also known as public health measures. So hand hygiene, respiratory etiquette, wearing masks now, isolation and quarantine, of course, and then social distancing, which is a nicer thing than, say, lockdowns. The people who are against lockdowns like to call them lockdowns because it sounds so terrible. It sounds like they're locking you up. So remember, it's all language and manipulating how your brain reacts to that. And then, of course, targeted antiviral treatment and prophylaxis. We actually have developed those for COVID, but it's panned out to be a bit of a moving target. Most of the monoclonal antibodies we produced are now no longer useful. And in fact, with the emergence of the latest subvariants like BQ.1.1 and XBB, which is a recombinant Delta Omicron virus, those actually don't work well at all. So very expensive to make, very expensive to purchase, and really have limited shelf life. The only thing that's maintained its activity to this point of any reasonableness is Paxlovid, which is an antiviral. The challenge that we have is that in the clinical trials, Paxlovid looked amazing, like 80% protection from being hospitalized if you took it and you were at risk, except that we know that was an efficacy measurement in a trial. If you look at effectiveness in real life, it's probably closer to 40%. So it's not the panacea. Doug Ford and his buddies all think Paxlovid's the answer. And of course, I would suggest that he probably knows more about selling signage than I do, but I probably know more about this virus than he does. So quickly about COVID-19 vaccination, some of this stuff you're very well aware of how amazing it is. This is actually just a summary slide that shows looking at the type of vaccine developed. So there's been a number of them developed. The Chinese have developed inactivated vaccines, as have the group in India. The vector vaccine, many of you will be familiar with, that's with the AstraZeneca and the Janssen vaccines that used an adenovirus vector. Protein subunit is Novavax, very typical, very similar technology to what we use for hepatitis B. And then, of course, the mRNA vaccines. And what this looks like, what this measures, and remember, it starts at 50%, not zero. This measures effectiveness against severe disease, and the bottom x-axis looks at efficacy against getting infected. And they all do a really good job of that. Now, unfortunately, it's a bit short term, and I won't bore you to tears, but coronaviruses have this notoriously nasty habit of you developing some immunity to them, particularly protective immunity, but sterilizing immunity, which is the prevention of infection, is short-lived. So it disappears after a few months, and that's typical of human coronaviruses. That's the other thing I did. And you didn't mention that in my bio. I was a coronavirus researcher back when everybody said, who cares about coronaviruses?
When was that?
Late 80s in Calgary, when I was an ID fellow.
What about ivermectin?
Doesn't work. Jeez. There's always somebody in the audience who's going to throw you like I just want to see his reaction. And we've got good randomized trials that tell us a lot about what works and what doesn't. So all these vaccines were looking like between 80 and 100% effective at preventing serious disease, and anywhere from about 65 upwards of 90% at preventing infection. But the last one is short-lived. The other one is longer-lived, the prevention of severe infection. The other thing that you can look at is against the different variants. So that at this time, when I got this graph from the paper, it was based on what we knew then, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. It doesn't include Omicron. Omicron would be considerably lower, probably sitting somewhere sort of just south of delta here. I'll put the arrow where I think it is. Hopefully the people on the screen can see the arrow that's sitting there. I don't know if they can, they can't be. Yeah, I'm supposed to use the laser pointer. See if I go like this. I use the laser. So this is where I think Omicron would sit. Now you can see it right. I think, yeah. So that's where I think Omicron would actually sit. So these vaccines were unbelievably effective. Now, this is actually a graph I've used a lot, and it's to explain to people what the impact of age is and what the impact of vaccination is. So what you see here along the x-axis is age, starting at 30 and going up to age 90. And the little red dots are the likelihood of you dying of COVID. And just pay important attention, this is a logarithmic scale. So if you're about 80 years old and you get COVID and you're not vaccinated, the risk of dying is about 1 in 100. If you're 30 years old, the risk of dying is somewhere around 1 in 10,000. Age is the primary determinant of your likelihood to get severe disease or die from COVID. And what you see with the blue arrows is the reduction in that likelihood of dying that's induced by getting at least 2 shots of the vaccine. And I would argue 3 and shots or boosters are even better. So if an 80-year-old gets vaccinated with at least 2 shots, their mortality goes down to that seen in a 50-year-old, which at that point is about 1 in 2,000. By the way, the 30-year-old is closer to 1 in 100,000. So yes, if I was 30 right now, and I didn't care about anybody else around me, I'd say, what's the big deal about COVID? Except that if you are, 70, 80 years old, there's a big deal about COVID, because if you're not vaccinated, you get it, there's a high probability you'll get severe disease at the very least and potentially die. So this has been the impact of vaccination on the COVID pandemic. So vaccination is important. Sometimes I use this to explain it to people, the Lego block thing, which shows, sort of the proportion of people who are unvaccinated versus vaccinated, and how vaccination makes a difference. Very rare, very uncommon to get severe disease. Some people will have moderate disease, probably because they're older, but the vast majority of people will either have an asymptomatic infection or a very mild infection with the vaccine. One of the challenges we have, and this is where we're going to get the lead in now into polio, is that vaccine rollout has been very asymmetrical across the globe. Obviously, countries that are of higher socioeconomic status have been able to pay for and get vaccines. Most of them are manufactured in those countries. But in many parts of the world, including Africa, the vaccination rates are actually quite low. And this is as of measured from October 18th, just a couple of days ago. So we're still really challenged. And of course, it's probably very, I think, pertinent with Rotarians because of the polio vaccine rollout and how we've recognized how challenging it's been since the eradication initiative was started in 1988. So what's the connection? And the connection really between COVID and polio is one of the challenges, one of the things that we never thought might happen, once we showed people how effective they were, was that actually it created a massive upsurge in anti-vaccine disinformation. And it was basically based on the fact that the mRNA vaccines were a relatively new platform. They're not actually that new. We've used mRNA vaccines in malaria and rabies actually since the early 2000s. But it was a very new thing for a mass vaccination. And so people had the ideas, well, RNA, isn't that like part of your genetics and things? And RNA is really a messenger. It's the DNA or genetics. But people who didn't understand it or had a very rudimentary understanding thought that if I gave you RNA, you would convert it to DNA and it would get in your genes and it would reprogram you to be like, I don't know, Gates or something like that. So they made all kinds of aspersions about safety and everything else because, they were new platforms. So we didn't have lots of safety data. We had, by the time they rolled out, we had about 6 months of safety data from the large numbers of recipients in the Moderna and Pfizer trials and the AstraZeneca trials, although we're talking about mRNAs. And the other thing that happened is at the same time, of course, this anti-mandate political ideology, which is very much driven by an ideological sort of spread, latched on not just to masks and not just to mandates about lockdowns, but to vaccines, because weren't they all part of the same conspiracy to control the world through something called the One World Order? I'm fascinated by this One World Order. The only time you find that mentioned is on Facebook and Twitter and other places, because it's all part of actually something that many of you know, if you're historians, has existed since, gosh, the Middle Ages, which was the idea that a select group of people were controlling everything. And frankly, one of the biggest challenges has been anti-Semitic in its tone, the idea that somehow Jewish people were the part of the One World Order, which is, of course, total unadulterated bullshit, pardon me for that. And then the other thing that it created was a lack of access to primary care. Physicians who are running primary care offices, your family doctor, were really worried in it, and they really converted over to a lot of virtual stuff. They saw very few people. But one of the most important things we know about vaccinations, primary care docs are they're the foundation stone for vaccination, routine vaccinations. And people trust their family doctors for vaccination information and for all those other things. So children now were starting to fall behind their routine childhood immunizations, one of which, of course, is polio vaccination. So the picture there, by the way, is Peter Hotez, who's one of my IT colleagues down in Texas. And he has a son who actually has autism, and he became a very significant counter argument to that Andrew Wakefield guy, who we can't even, well, we can call him doctor because he has a degree, but he's been struck from the register, as they say in England, because he was promoting the absolutely incorrect idea that measles and mumps rubella vaccines caused autism. By the way, right. Even the courts have looked at that. And remember, the courts are kind of a little bit, oh yeah, maybe. They've actually said, no, there's no evidence whatsoever. And I can tell you scientifically, there is none at all. And so this turned into this huge broad, I'm not going to ask you to look at this, but it's to sort of show you the sort of spider web created by anti-vaccine sentiments and the concerns that arose from them. And some of them are legitimate concerns, like, do you have long-term safety data? No. Okay, well, that must mean it's going to hurt and kill people. The most fascinating one, and I was approached last night after I gave a talk at St. Lawrence College, I participated in a forum, a lady who came up to me and said, well, you know, Dr. Evans, lots of people have died. There's a lot of excess mortality, and it's only happened since the COVID-19 vaccines were rolled out. I'm like, the other thing, man, was that there was a pandemic going on that was killing lots of old people. It's also possible that that's the confounding signal that you're not looking at. But when you get your information from Facebook and from Twitter and assorted other bad places, yeah, it just makes it seems like a lot of sense. Some of you may have heard about the Florida Surgeon General is a known anti-vaxxer, which is why DeSantis hired him in that job. And he put out a study, very badly designed if you're a scientist to look at. I mean, just suggests that the vaccine was killing young men from heart disease. And it's so fundamentally flawed, I can't even bother to show you what the sort of things were. But that's the kind of stuff that has been propagated. And it's been propagated by high-reaching authorities. The Surgeon General of the state of Florida says it's killing young men. People will go, well, that's a doctor, and he must know what he's talking about. No. There's a lot of bad doctors out there. No, I should say that. There's a